What if I told you the golden age of RPGs didn't start on Nintendo, but on a console built out of pure revenge? Back in the 90s, Sony wasn't even in the game, literally. Then Nintendo made a massive mistake, and Sony flipped the entire industry on its head. This is the wild, untold story of how a failed partnership, a tech gamble, and one legendary game turned the PlayStation into the ultimate RPG machine. Stick around because what really happened might surprise you. After things went south between Sony and Nintendo during their failed partnership, Sony didn't waste time crying over it. They went all in and decided to build their own console from scratch. The idea was simple: create a gaming system that was more affordable than the competition and push it hard with the power of CD technology, something Sony already dominated thanks to their experience in music and film. But price alone wasn't enough to win gamers over, and Sony knew the real weapon would be the games. So they went straight to the heavy hitters developers like Capcom, Konami, and Namco, companies already killing it in arcades and console gaming. These studios were experimenting with 3D gameplay, and the PlayStation came in at just the right time. It launched 2 years ahead of the Nintendo 64, giving Sony a huge head start in forming partnerships. Plus, using CDs instead of cartridges meant way more storage, lower production costs, and better audio and video. Sony made their own discs, so they cut costs even further. Meanwhile, Nintendo stuck to cartridges, which were more expensive to produce and held way less data. Even compared to the Sega Saturn, which launched just days apart, the PlayStation had the edge when it came to handling 3D games, and that mattered a lot. The industry was shifting from 2D to 3D, and Sony was ready for it. This perfect storm made the PlayStation the go-to platform for developers looking to build bigger, better games. And that's exactly why titles like Resident Evil and Metal Gear Solid turned out the way they did. The extra space on the discs allowed for more cutscenes, better sound design, and deeper stories. Here's the crazy part. Sony's physical media, like CDs and DVDs, became so dominant that even competitors like Microsoft had to pay royalties just to use them. But that wasn't Sony's smartest move. What really changed the game was their decision to invest in one specific genre that had been quietly building momentum since the late 80s, RPGs. Back then, studios like Squaresoft and Enix were already crushing it in Japan, with series like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. These games were massive hits over there, but barely made a dent in the West. The problem? Nintendo had tight control over its third-party partners. They wanted exclusivity, and smaller studios, especially RPG developers, couldn't really push back like big names such as Capcom or Konami could. To make it worse, localizing a game back then wasn't cheap. Translating all that text into English, reworking menus, fixing bugs, it took serious time and money. And with Nintendo acting as the gatekeeper for Western distribution, most of the profits stayed in their pockets. So for developers, going global just didn't seem worth it. Sony saw that pain point and went straight for it. They opened the door wide for those Japanese RPG creators. No more fighting over exclusivity, no more splitting profits, and suddenly, there was a real opportunity to bring those deep, story-driven games to a whole new audience. What's wild is that the RPG wave on PlayStation didn't start with Final Fantasy VII. It had a warm-up act. Games like King's Field, which dropped early in the console's life, were already testing the waters. That game was clunky, slow, and honestly kind of brutal. But it offered something most RPGs hadn't tried yet: fully 3D environments and real-time exploration. It laid the groundwork for what RPGs could look like on this new hardware. And yeah, it didn't blow up like Square's stuff, but it showed there was an appetite for deeper, more immersive experiences way before the genre exploded. But the real turning point came when things completely fell apart between Squaresoft and Nintendo. Their relationship had been rocky for a while, but eventually it hit a wall. For about 6 or 7 years, Square didn't release a single game on a Nintendo console, not even one. Yeah, that's why the Nintendo 64 never got a proper Final Fantasy title. Sony saw the opening and jumped in fast. They offered Square something that Nintendo never did: freedom, funding, and full marketing support. That's how Final Fantasy VII landed on the PlayStation. At the time, the series was already a giant in Japan, but it hadn't fully broken through in the West. Sony promised to handle all the costs of publishing and promoting the game in the US. In return, Square didn't have to lift a finger outside of developing the game itself. Sony went hard with the marketing. We're talking magazine ads, TV spots, tie-ins with Pepsi, and even flying American journalists to Japan to cover the game's release firsthand. That kind of push was unheard of for an RPG, and it worked. Final Fantasy VII became a global phenomenon, selling around 10 million copies and finally making the series explode outside of Japan. That one move changed everything. Square went from being just another respected developer to the undisputed king of RPGs. With their new momentum, they dropped hit after hit: Chrono Cross, Xenogears, Vagrant Story, Parasite Eve, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, Tactics, and more. Once other studios saw what Squaresoft pulled off with Final Fantasy VII, it didn't take long for them to follow suit. Enix jumped in with Dragon Quest VII and Star Ocean 2. And Sony didn't just publish the latter, they went all in on the marketing. That push helped make it one of the most recognized entries in the series, especially in the West. Sony knew they had something special going on with RPGs, so they doubled down. They started funding their own exclusive titles like Wild Arms, Legend of Legaia, and the cult classic The Legend of Dragoon. These weren't just filler games, they were bold, ambitious, and showed that Sony wanted to be more than just a platform. They wanted to shape the future of the genre. And the variety was just insane. You had games like Thousand Arms mixing dating sim vibes with turn-based battles, which was as weird as it was fun. Then there was Alundra, kind of like a darker, edgier cousin of Zelda, full of brutal puzzles and deep story beats. Some titles, like Azure Dreams, mashed up dungeon crawling with monster collecting and town building. It felt like every new RPG was trying something different. Some hit big, others stayed under the radar. But the PlayStation became a creative lab where devs weren't afraid to take risks. And we can't talk about PlayStation RPGs without mentioning the music. Those soundtracks hit different. Whether it was the emotional piano in Final Fantasy VIII Eyes on Me, the haunting mood of Xenogears, or that iconic opening theme from Legend of Dragoon, these games sounded like something bigger. They weren't just background noise. They pulled you into the story, made boss fights feel epic, and gave quiet moments real weight. Some of those tracks still live rent-free in people's heads decades later. Hey guys, if you're enjoying this video, do me a favor and drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. And if you want to go the extra mile, becoming a channel member helps a ton and gives you early access to all future videos. Thanks for the support, and now, back to the video. And it wasn't just the big names getting love. Smaller developers who'd never dreamed of releasing their games outside Japan suddenly had a real shot. If a game had even a hint of RPG in its DNA, it was welcomed on the PlayStation. Even titles that originally came out for other platforms got ported just to ride the wave, like Grandia, which started on the Sega Saturn but became way more popular after Sony brought it to the West in 1999. PlayStation even became a second home for RPG classics from the Super Nintendo era. Games like Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Tales of Phantasia all got fresh releases on the PS1 because fans were hungry for them and Sony was paying attention. Konami brought out Suikoden, which quickly earned a loyal following. Atlus, despite being a smaller studio at the time, took a risk and launched Persona in the West. The first game didn't blow up, but it planted the seed. Then came Eternal Punishment, and the franchise started gaining real traction. That era cracked the door open for a ton of overlooked titles and studios. Atlus even helped localize and publish games from other developers, giving them a shot they never would have had otherwise. Everyone benefited: the studios, the fans, and of course the PlayStation brand. Before the PlayStation came along, most Western RPGs lived on PC. That was their home turf. And back then, the gap between PC and console gamers was huge. Different audiences and different expectations. It wasn't like today, where a game like Final Fantasy can drop on both platforms and feel right at home either way. In the 90s, owning a decent gaming PC wasn't cheap. You needed the right hardware, you had to deal with installations, patches, weird compatibility issues. It wasn't exactly plug and play. Consoles, on the other hand, were way more accessible. You just popped in a disc and started playing. That simplicity made the PlayStation the perfect place to introduce more people to the RPG genre. Sony knew that, and they weren't afraid to experiment. Even some PC-born games like Diablo got ported to the PS1. Sure, the controls were a bit clunky compared to mouse and keyboard, but for a lot of people, that was their very first taste of the franchise. And that first impression stuck. If a game launched there, it had a real shot at success. But Sony didn't just change the game back in the day, they're still protecting that legacy today. Behind the scenes, they've built something called the PlayStation Studios Vault. And yeah, it's as epic as it sounds. We're talking over 200 million files stored in a literal mineshaft, no joke. It's packed with old source code, art, music, dev tools, and everything else that went into making those legendary games. Titles like Ark the Lad, Wild Arms, and Vagrant Story are all in there, locked down and preserved like gaming fossils, but way cooler. It's kind of crazy how much influence those old PlayStation RPGs still have today. You see it in modern games all the time, stuff like Persona 5, Octopath Traveler, and even the Final Fantasy VII Remake are clearly built on the foundation that era laid down. The emotional storytelling, the layered combat systems, the unforgettable music, it all traces back to the PlayStation 1 days. That generation of games didn't just shape players, it shaped future developers. A lot of the folks making today's best RPGs grew up on that golden era, and now they're passing the torch with their own spin on it. So, now I gotta ask, what's your favorite RPG from the PlayStation era? Was it one of the big names, or maybe a hidden gem? Drop it in the comments, I'd love to hear your picks. And hey, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your fellow RPG fans. Thanks for hanging out. See you in the next one.